In December 2019, Russia and China signed an agreement to build Power of Siberia 2, a massive natural gas pipeline that would transport approximately 50 billion cubic meters of Russian gas annually to China through Mongolia. The estimated cost is roughly $300 billion over the life of the project, making it one of the largest energy infrastructure investments in history. And here's what makes this absolutely critical as we close out 2025. Throughout 2024-2025, this pipeline project has been accelerating toward reality, and once operational around 2030, it will fundamentally eliminate any possibility of Europe ever regaining access to Russian gas, even if political relationships normalize. Let me explain why this matters so profoundly right now in late 2025. Russia produces approximately 700 billion cubic meters of natural gas annually. Before the Ukraine war in 2021, Russia sent roughly 155 billion cubic meters to Europe through various pipeline routes. That was 40% of European gas consumption, the foundation of European energy security for decades. Throughout 2022-2025, Russian gas to Europe has fallen to approximately 20 billion cubic meters annually, a 90% collapse. Most of that lost European supply hasn't disappeared. It's been redirected to China, which now receives roughly 50 billion cubic meters annually from Russia via existing Power of Siberia, one pipeline and other routes. Power of Siberia 2, when completed around 2030, will add another 50 billion cubic meters of annual Russian gas exports to China. Combined with existing Power of Siberia 1 at roughly 38 billion cubic meters capacity and potential expansions, Russia-China gas trade could reach 100+ billion cubic meters annually by early 2030s. That's not just replacing the lost European market, that's potentially exceeding it, creating Russia-China energy relationship that dwarfs what Russia-Europe ever was. And here's the devastating implication for Europe. Once Russia has locked in 100+ billion cubic meters annually to China through pipelines that cost $260+ billion to build, those pipelines will operate for 40-50 years regardless of politics. The gas that used to flow west will flow east permanently. Europe's remaining energy security throughout 2025 rests on the hope that maybe someday Russian gas could return if relationships normalize. Power of Siberia 2 eliminates that possibility by physically reorienting Russian gas infrastructure toward Asia in ways that can't be reversed. Now let me show you the specific details of Power of Siberia 2 because understanding the infrastructure reveals why this is irreversible. The pipeline would run approximately 2,600 kilometers from Russia's Yamal gas fields in western Siberia through Mongolia to China. These are the same Yamal fields that used to supply Europe via pipelines before the war. Gazprom throughout 2024-2025 has been conducting preliminary engineering and route surveys. Discussions with Mongolia throughout 2024-2025 have focused on transit agreements and compensation. Discussions with China throughout 2024-2025 have focused on pricing and delivery schedules. Target completion date discussed throughout 2024-2025 is approximately 2030, though some analysts suggest 2031-2032 is more realistic given the engineering challenges and the 2,600-kilometer distance through difficult terrain, including permafrost regions. Capacity when fully operational would be approximately 50 billion cubic meters annually. This is comparable to Nord Stream 1 pipeline that used to carry 55 billion cubic meters annually from Russia to Germany before it was destroyed in 2022. Cost estimates throughout 2024-2025 discussions range from $260 billion to over $300 billion, depending on whether you include just pipeline construction or also upstream gas field development required to supply the pipeline. This is massive investment that once made represents sunk cost locking in the route for decades. Let me explain what this means for Russian gas export strategy throughout 2025-2035. Russia throughout 2022-2025 has been systematically cutting ties with European gas market. Nord Stream destroyed, flows through Ukraine minimal and likely to end completely when current transit agreement expires in 2024. Yamal Europe pipeline reversed. Only remaining routes are Turk Stream to Turkey-Hungary, and some Ukraine transit that serves Austria and Slovakia. These remaining European routes carry approximately 15 to 20 billion cubic meters annually as of late 2025, less than 15% of pre-war levels. Russia, throughout 2024-2025, has made clear through actions and statements that European market is not priority and may be abandoned entirely. Meanwhile, Russia-China gas trade has been growing rapidly. Power of Siberia 1, which began operations in December 2019, ramped up throughout 2020-2024 to reach design capacity of approximately 38 billion cubic meters annually by 2024-2025. Chinese demand for Russian gas throughout 2024-2025 has been strong. China needs gas for power generation, heating, industrial uses, and environmental goals to reduce coal dependence. Russian gas at discounted prices compared to LNG is attractive to China both economically and strategically. Power of Siberia 2, when completed around 2030, would give Russia-China gas relationship total capacity of roughly 88 billion cubic meters annually from Power of Siberia 1 and 2 combined. If additional smaller pipeline projects are completed, total could approach 100 plus billion cubic meters by early 2030s. This would exceed what Russia ever sold to Europe at peak, creating Russia-China energy interdependence that's deeper than Russia-Europe relationship ever was. Subscribe to this channel if you want continued coverage of how this Russia-China energy axis develops through 2030, because mainstream European coverage often ignores the strategic implications of losing Russian gas permanently. Now let me show you what Europe's remaining energy security actually looks like in late 2025. Europe throughout 2022-2025 has successfully replaced most Russian pipeline gas through combination of increased LNG imports from US, Qatar, and others, rising from approximately 80 billion cubic meters in 2021 to 150 plus billion cubic meters by 2024-2025. Increased pipeline gas from Norway rising from 120 billion cubic meters to 125 plus billion cubic meters. Increased pipeline gas from Algeria maintaining roughly 30-40 billion cubic meters, and reduced consumption falling from 400 billion cubic meters to approximately 350 billion cubic meters. Adding these up, Europe has replaced approximately 140 billion cubic meters of lost Russian supply. This is enormous achievement accomplished in just 3-4 years through emergency measures, infrastructure build-out, and economic adjustment. But Europe's energy security throughout late 2025 remains precarious for several reasons. LNG is more expensive than pipeline gas was. European gas prices throughout 2024-2025 remain structurally higher than pre-war levels, costing European industry competitiveness. LNG supply is globally traded and subject to competition. If Asian demand increases, Europe might struggle to secure supplies at reasonable prices. LNG infrastructure, while expanded, is still constrained. Europe needs continued terminal construction to have full redundancy. Pipeline alternatives, Norway, Algeria, are largely maxed out. Significant production increases are difficult without major new investments. Europe throughout 2025 has breathing room and adequate supplies, but the system lacks the slack and resilience that 155 billion cubic meters of cheap Russian pipeline gas used to provide. Any major disruption, severe winter, supply interruption from Norway or Algeria, global LNG shortage could trigger energy crisis. Europe's remaining energy security throughout 2025 depends on everything working perfectly. There's little buffer for problems, and the possibility of Russian gas ever returning as backup option is being eliminated by Power of Siberia 2 permanently redirecting Russian gas eastward. Let me explain what Russia gains strategically from Power of Siberia 2 beyond just alternative customers. Energy leverage over China is first benefit. When Russia supplies 100+ billion cubic meters annually to China, China becomes dependent on Russian gas for a significant portion of energy needs. This gives Russia leverage in Russia-China relationship that currently is quite unbalanced in China's favor. China is larger economy, larger population, more dynamic growth. Russia needs China more than China needs Russia in most dimensions. But energy is one area where Russia has something China needs. Power of Siberia 2 deepens Chinese dependence on Russian energy, giving Russia more negotiating power in bilateral relationship. Revenue stream for decades is second benefit. Once Power of Siberia 2 is built, it generates revenue for 40-50 years of operations. Even if gas prices are lower than Russia received from Europe historically, predictable long-term revenue from China is valuable for Russian budget planning and economic stability. Diversification away from Europe is third benefit. Russia throughout 2025 has learned that European market is unreliable when geopolitical tensions arise. Europe cut Russian gas imports by 90% in just 3 years through sanctions and alternative supply development. Russia doesn't want to be dependent on a single market that can cut off purchases for political reasons. By developing Chinese market to comparable or larger scale than European market was, Russia ensures that loss of any single market doesn't threaten Russian gas export viability. This is strategic insurance against future geopolitical conflicts affecting energy trade. Now let me show you what China gains from Power of Siberia 2. Secure gas supply from land-based pipeline is first benefit. China imports significant LNG, but LNG supply routes can be disrupted. Ships can be blocked, terminals can be attacked, suppliers can redirect cargoes. Pipeline from Russia through Mongolia into China is much more secure from Chinese perspective. If U.S.-China tensions escalate to conflict over Taiwan or other issues, U.S. Navy could potentially blockade Chinese LNG imports, but pipeline gas from Russia would continue flowing regardless of maritime blockades. This strategic security is enormously valuable to China. Relatively cheap gas is second benefit. Russia throughout 2024-2025 has been selling gas to China at prices below global LNG rates. While exact prices aren't public, estimates suggest Russian pipeline gas to China costs $10 or $12 per million BTU, compared to Asian LNG prices that fluctuate between $12-20 per million BTU. This $2 to $8 per million BTU savings across 50 billion cubic meters annually from Power of Siberia 2 could save China roughly $5-15 billion per year, depending on global price levels. Over 40-50 years of pipeline operations, cumulative savings could reach hundreds of billions. Leverage over Russia is third benefit. Once Power of Siberia 2 is built, Russia has sunk $260+ billion into infrastructure that only serves Chinese market. Russia becomes dependent on Chinese purchases to justify the investment. This gives China leverage in bilateral relationship. Russia can't easily threaten to cut supplies when Russia needs Chinese market to recoup investment. Let me tell you what happens to global gas markets throughout 2025-2035 as Russia reorients toward China. Global gas trade is roughly 550 billion cubic meters annually via pipeline and approximately 550 billion cubic meters via LNG, for total around 100 billion cubic meters of internationally traded gas. Russia-Europe trade collapsing from 155 billion cubic meters to 15-20 billion cubic meters throughout 2022-2025 represented roughly 13% of global gas trade, shifting away from established route. Europe replaced this mostly with LNG, tightening global LNG markets throughout 2022-2024 and contributing to high prices. Russia-China trade growing from essentially zero pre-2020 to potentially 100 plus billion cubic meters by early 2030s represents roughly 10% of global gas trade shifting to new route. This redirects Russian gas from European market where it's no longer wanted to Asian market where it's needed. The net effect throughout 2025-2035 is bifurcation of global gas markets into distinct regional systems. European market served by Norway, Algeria, and LNG imports from diverse sources. Asian market increasingly served by Russia via pipelines plus LNG imports, and American market served by domestic production plus some Canadian imports. These regional markets throughout 2025-2035 will have less integration and arbitrage than before 2022. Prices will differ more between regions. Security of supply will depend more on regional infrastructure and less on global market flexibility. This fragmentation makes energy security more challenging for everyone because regional disruptions can't be easily offset by global supply rerouting. Now let me explain what this means for European strategy toward Russia throughout 2025-2035. Some European policymakers throughout 2024-2025 have hoped that eventually, maybe after Putin, Russia-Europe energy relationships could normalize. Power of Siberia 2 makes this impossible. Once Russian gas infrastructure is reoriented toward China with $260+ billion investment in pipelines and upstream development, that gas won't return to Europe even if political relationships improve. The physical infrastructure determines flow patterns, and once built toward China, that's permanent for decades. Europe throughout 2025-2030 needs to accept that Russian gas is gone permanently, not temporarily. Energy security strategy throughout 2025-2035 must be based on assumption of zero Russian gas, rather than hope that maybe someday relationships normalize and cheap Russian pipeline gas returns. This requires continued massive investment in LNG terminals to handle all imports via LNG, pipeline connections internally to distribute LNG from coastal terminals to landlocked countries, gas storage capacity to buffer against supply disruptions, renewable energy and nuclear to reduce gas dependence overall, and energy efficiency to minimize consumption. Cost of this infrastructure throughout 2025-2035 will be hundreds of billions of euros. European energy will be structurally more expensive than when Russian pipeline gas was available. European industry will be less competitive globally due to higher energy costs. These are permanent costs of eliminating Russian energy dependence. Let me tell you what I personally think Power of Siberia 2 represents strategically. This pipeline is Russia and China jointly constructing alternative to Western-dominated energy system. Instead of Russian gas flowing to Europe, where revenues could be frozen by Western sanctions and supplies could be cut for political reasons, Russian gas will flow to China, where both countries see strategic benefit in energy interdependence outside Western control. Power of Siberia 2 throughout 2024-2025 discussions represents concrete manifestation of Russia-China no limits partnership declared in February 2022, just before Russian invasion of Ukraine. Energy is foundation of this partnership. Russia provides resources that China needs. China provides market and financing that Russia needs. The $260+ billion investment over project lifetime is comparable to Marshall Plan in inflation-adjusted terms. This is massive capital commitment that will define Russia-China economic integration for 40-50 years. Once pipeline is operational, Europe throughout 2025 is watching this Russia-China energy axis forming and recognizing that the world that existed before 2022, where Russian gas flowed to Europe and supported European industry, is gone forever. Power of Siberia 2 is the infrastructure that makes that divorce permanent and irreversible. Russia's latest pipeline deal worth $260+ billion to build Power of Siberia 2 could collapse Europe's remaining energy security by permanently eliminating possibility of Russian gas ever returning to European market, even if political relationships eventually normalize. Throughout 2024-2025, this pipeline has moved from concept to serious planning with route surveys, Mongolia transit negotiations, and China purchase agreements being finalized. Target completion around 2030 with capacity of 50 billion cubic meters annually. Combined with existing power of Siberia 1, Russia-China gas trade could reach 100 plus billion cubic meters annually by early 2030s, exceeding what Russia-Europe trade ever was at peak. This permanently reorients Russian gas infrastructure toward Asia. Europe's remaining energy security in late 2025 depends on LNG imports, Norwegian and Algerian pipeline gas, and reduced consumption. This system works, but lacks resilience and keeps energy costs structurally higher than when Russian gas was available. Any hope of Russian gas returning as backup option is being eliminated by power of Siberia 2. As 2025 ends, the Russia-China energy axis is forming through concrete infrastructure investment that will define global gas markets for decades. Europe has successfully replaced Russian gas, but at permanent cost of higher prices and less secure supply. The pipeline deal worth 260 plus billion is physical manifestation of permanent divorce between Russian energy and European consumption. That was 40 plus years in building and just 3 years in destroying. The deal is advancing. The pipeline will be built. And Europe's remaining hope that maybe Russian gas could return someday is collapsing as Russia invests hundreds of billions in infrastructure that flows gas east toward China rather than west toward Europe for the next 40, 50 years, regardless of how political relationships evolve.